here. Welcome everybody. We're glad to have everybody with us tonight, and hope everybody's doing well, staying safe, and not going out too much. I did want to say that I don't know why I keep getting messages on my. Oh well, never mind. Next week we will have a discussion of evolution and new findings on human evolution. And the week after, we will have Adam Lee from the Pathos Daylight Atheism. His book is Daylight Atheism, and he has a blog called Daylight Atheism. And the week after that, we will have somebody from the Foundation Beyond Belief. So we're lined up for the next few weeks. And then sometime in August, Mr. Ghali is going to amuse us and educate us with stories about Madeline Murray O'Hare. And Mr. Peterson is going to talk about climate change. So we've got some interesting topics coming up. So I hope everyone stays on our mailing list and gets notified when these things are coming up. We have some other speakers lined up and some invitations out. Trying to get somebody from the Florida legislature to come and talk to us about vouchers in the school system. So we'll keep you informed of those things. So tonight we have Jim Young, who's going to talk to us about critical thinking. And I did not do a bio of Mr. Young, so I'm hoping he can introduce himself. He is a former minister who has become a heathen like the rest of us. So I ask that everyone please stay muted. And Mr. Young, as soon as I can find you over here on the list of people.
Now you should be able to hear me.
Whoa, yes, and see you, Mr. Reinhardt.
Oh.
Well, don't go away. I'm going to go get my mask. You're looking at a guy that hasn't shaved in 4 days.
Oh my, and we can tell.
Well, Joan went up to North Carolina with a couple of her girlfriends to play golf, and I haven't had much reason to get out of bed.
I see.
You let yourself go.
Well, we're glad you got out of bed. Well, I assume you're out of bed to join us, but we're glad you're here.
I'm not dressed, but
That's okay. We don't care. As long as you're dressed from that chest up.
You don't have to demonstrate for us.
No, you don't. Okay, Mr. Young, it is all yours, and you're ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much. I am pleased to be able to be here. We could get cut off because of unstable internet. You never know, but it doesn't look like rain here at the moment, so perhaps we'll make it. Judy did a good job of introducing me. I am an atheist who was once a religious fanatic and street preacher, evangelist, and eventually I grew up. That's the short of it. So I've been associated with the Atheists of Florida since the late 90s and was involved in a great deal of activism. One of the things that I've learned since becoming involved in activism is I've learned a good bit about critical thinking. And today I'd like to talk to you about critical thinking. Mostly, rather than trying to teach a course in critical thinking, what I'm actually going to do is simply restrict my comments to obstacles to critical thinking. So at the end of the slideshow, I'll be giving a link to a website where you can take a free course in critical thinking if you so desire. So we'll get at it. We're going to be talking about the obstacles primarily. What is critical thinking? It's a complex set of skills that we can learn and employ and refine over time with a view to improving the quality of our own thinking. These slides contain a great deal of information that I have learned from a particular website, which happens to be the foundation of critical thinking. And I have permission from them to talk about these various concepts, so I won't run into any problem. I do recommend them as a source if you're looking for books and videos on the subject. And I also will be referencing, like as I said at the end of the slide presentation, on another website where you can take a course free. The goal today is to understand and appreciate the obstacles to quality thinking, to appreciate that learning about critical thinking concepts and skills, and then applying them to our reasoning is worth the time and effort. Who's going to benefit from this? Well, primarily us. Critical thinking primarily benefits those who apply critical thinking concepts to their reasoning. And as a result of that, society benefits when we teach others how to handle information and encourage them to process critically. I do want to mention before I get too deep into this, if anyone in the audience wishes to comment or question, please raise your hand and Judy can stop me and we can hear what you have to say or ask. I don't have any objection to that. I have a lot of slides, but I think that we can get through them without any problem. So don't worry about interrupting. You can interrupt as much as you like. There are two approaches to reasoning. There is the uncritical approach. Uncritical thinkers spend the majority of their time and effort trying to defend and confirm ideas they already believe. I'm sure you are familiar with these types of individuals if you've ever had arguments with them or tried to reason with them. They're not very easy to reason with. Critical thinkers, on the other hand, exhibit a willingness to expend time and effort and a continuing search for better answers to complex problems. So if you present evidence or solid arguments to critical thinkers, they tend to be willing to entertain the idea that they might be wrong. There are three types of reflective individuals that I would like to talk about. The first being unreflective individuals who engage in little or no critical analysis of ideas. They are unaware of their vulnerability to intellectual manipulation. And while they think their beliefs are a product of choice, their beliefs usually reflect the views of others, often fed to them by those skilled in the art of manipulative sophistry. They often do not understand universal ethics and are easily enticed to believe and practice pseudo-ethics. I'm sure you can identify with these people. Then we have another group of individuals who are unethically reflective. These individuals are poorly skilled in the concepts of critical thinking, but they are highly skilled in sophistry and the art of persuasion. Their goal is not the furtherance of best answers or social justice, but rather manipulating and controlling the thinking of others with a view to gain power, wealth, social status, and advantage. These would be your con artists. I will also accuse preachers of being guilty of this type of reflective thinking. And then we have probably the smallest group of individuals who are ethically reflective. They're individuals who are acutely aware of their egocentric and sociocentric tendencies and how sophistry is used to manipulate thinking. They know and understand the concepts of critical thinking and engage in critical analysis of everything they are asked to believe. These individuals have no agenda to deceive, manipulate, or unscrupulously control the thinking of others. Instead, they are in constant search for knowledge, best solutions to questions or problems, and equitable treatment for themselves and others. Now, in talking about these three groups of individuals, sometimes people can cross from one level to another in their reflective thinking. So we're not always trapped in one particular level. It depends sometimes on how invested we are in an idea. We may ourselves engage in sophistry at times, and we need to be aware of that. So the reason I'm bringing this up about the three levels of reflective individuals is hopefully to raise our awareness of what's out there and where we are, and hopefully we want to be ethically reflective all the time, so we can aspire to that. Now, the solution to uncritical thinking is obviously to learn about obstacles to clear thinking and to learn about concepts vital to clear thinking, and then bring those ethical concepts to bear upon our thinking processes and in our interactions with other people. The first thing that we have to do is to understand the human condition. And there are many characteristics that define us as human beings. One of them is we are naturally intellectually lazy. A person is being lazy if they're able to carry out some activity they ought to carry out, but are disinclined to do so because of the effort involved. We want others to do the hard work of thinking for us, and as a result of that, we often do. We just let somebody else handle it, and many times that can be to our disadvantage. We are naive, victims of inherited beliefs. The definition of naive is being immature, unaware, or overly trusting. I'll give you an example of that. An example of naive is when someone believes that ghosts exist because their parents said so. And we've all been victims of that kind of indoctrination. It starts as children. So many of our beliefs are fed to us by authority figures and just simply accepted on that basis. We are also gullible. Gullibility is a failure of social intelligence in which a person is easily tricked or manipulated into an ill-advised course of action. People may stop questioning premises because doing so is forbidden by an authority figure. I'll give an example of a particular religion. Perhaps someone is a member of a denomination in Christianity that does not tolerate questioning or challenging any of its dogma. And people are intimidated into silence. So They essentially adopt every single doctrine of that particular institution without questioning it. And because of the fear, they absolutely will not question it. We are myopic. Myopic is an adjective meaning short-sighted in every sense of the word, really. Example, for instance, myopic students have no interest in anything beyond what is on the test. So we're unfortunately in public schools in the state of Florida, for example, we have this system where students are taught the test, and that's all they're taught. And the students have little or no interest in anything beyond what's on the test. As a result, they don't really have a comprehensive understanding of many of the subjects that they're taking. We also nurture unfair bias. I mentioned the word unfair to distinguish unfair bias from justified bias. Unfairly prejudiced for or against someone or something is an unfair bias. But suppose I have a bias in favor of the scientific method or the community, the scientific community at large, or maybe I have a bias in mathematics being reliable. We have lots of biases, but they're justified. So I don't want to exclude every bias, but we need to be careful about our biases, because bias can prevent us from objectively entertaining controvert evidence and the possibility our beliefs could be errant. Okay, playing fast and loose with words. Well, I've been guilty of that. I've been guilty of all these things, by the way. So I aspire to do better, but playing fast and loose with words, we tend to use words inappropriately, changing their definition to suit our agenda and to make our arguments more appealing. And to give you an example of that, when you think about the abortion controversy and you listen to these anti-abortion activists talk about a fertilized egg as being a baby, that would be an inappropriate use of the word baby. And the abortion being referred to as murder of a baby would also be an inappropriate definition of the word murder. And of course, it's done to make their argument more appealing. However, deliberately misinterpreting a statement to allege a false position and then attacking it is really a straw man argument, because women who seek abortions are not wanting to murder babies. Anyway, I thought that would be a very good example. We are also often guilty of dogmatic thinking and blind faith, contemplating things according to a set of agenda-driven rules. Now, when we think about this, we can usually think about religion or politics very easily, but it doesn't have to be confined to those two genres. One problem with dogmatic thinking is that it is hostile to critical thinking concepts. We're all guilty of irrational thinking. Irrational thinking is thinking that is inconsistent with, unsupported by, or hostile to known facts. Again, when you start arguing with someone who is a political or religious activist, they may exhibit this characteristic of especially being hostile to facts and sound judgments. Intransigence and or inflexibility. This is an unwillingness to, or a refusal to change one's views or to agree about something. And this is one of the reasons I don't like debates, because when you go to a debate, the goal of the people who are arguing debates is to win the debate, and usually at all costs. So everything goes out the window when you're in a debate situation. I much prefer, if I'm going to talk to someone who has a different view, that it really be a relaxed discussion where they don't feel like that they have to win. However, a lot of people can't talk about issues which they don't believe in without automatically going on the defensive. So it's very, very difficult. Delusions result when irrational thoughts and beliefs become so fixed that nothing, including contrary evidence, can convince a person that what they think or feel is true, is not true. And I'd say this is hugely, it's one of our biggest problems that we have. When we close our mind to other ideas, we're not going to benefit from any information that people give to us. We're shutting it out. And if we really care about learning, we just have to fight against this intransigence. Now I want to talk about three types of evidence, arguments, questions that can be very confusing at times. Facts are known truths. Now, it's a natural inclination that we want to claim that everything we believe is a fact. And when you get into a conversation or you listen to a debate, you very carefully listen to the presenters in a debate, they'll often use terms like, it's a matter of fact, such and such and such, or it's a fact, or the fact of the matter is. And oftentimes, it isn't a fact at all. They just want to present it to be received as a fact. They want the audience to accept that that's the validity that what they're claiming has. In reality, what they are presenting to be facts might be possibly a sound judgment. Now, sound judgments are derived from inductive reasoning, and I'm not going to go into inductive reasonings, but that's where sound judgments are made, such as in a court of law. And these are opinions formed on the basis of the objective examination of all available evidence. It could include facts, inferences, forensic evidence, all sorts of stuff, but all of that is examined in detail, and a person tries to come up with the best answer to that complex question. So sound judgments almost always have to do with complex questions. And then we, of course, have to deal with subjective preferential opinion. Now, subjective opinions often are formed in disregard to any evidence at all. So that you will easily find in politics and in religion, where people just have a closed mind, intransigent, they don't like evidence, their mind is made up, but they prefer a particular position, and so that is what they adopt. Now, we're often inclined to give our arguments greater value than what they deserve, and at the same time devaluing the arguments of those who disagree with us. We have to be on guard against that if we want to be credible. Now, unscrupulous manipulators of data will ignore the distinction between well-substantiated facts, logical inferences, reasonable judgments, and subjective preferential opinion. The sophist caught using unscrupulous tactics will invariably shift the ground. That's a sophist tactic, in an attempt to invoke the defense, I have a right to my opinion. So you may have a conversation, let's say it's with a religious fanatic, and maybe you're talking about intelligent design, and they want to present their arguments as being facts, and you call them out on it. They're not facts. Mad, and they might say, well, I have a right to my opinion. Well, of course, they do have a right to an opinion, but they don't have a right to misrepresent facts. So I recently had a debate with someone about your ID, and it's funny how they resort to all kinds of excuses for denying credible science. Okay, so I'm going to continue. We're going to talk about ethics for a moment. When we engage other people, and let's say we're trying to persuade them, we need to engage them ethically. Now, I put two universal standards for universal ethics here on the screen. One is refusing to subject others who are different to the malevolent treatment we ourselves would object to being subjected to. So a lot of times people, when you are arguing with them or debating with them, they will resort to ad hominem attacks. That is how they can win the argument, if they can attack the messenger. We need to be very careful if we're engaged in debates or interactions with people and not accuse them of being stupid and the like, because what we're doing is making ourselves look less credible. We can avoid that and just present the evidence. And secondly, we need to demand of ourselves the same moral, ethical, intellectual integrity we demand of others. So if we say something is a fact, it needs to be a fact. If it's claim it's a sound judgment, it really should be a sound judgment. We shouldn't try to confuse. And caught making that error, we should just fess up. We shouldn't try to use an excuse like, well, I have a right to my opinion. I want to talk about pseudo-ethics for a moment. Historically, we've seen pseudo-ethics nurtured and practiced in every domain of human culture, cloaked in religion, politics, law, social conventions, sexual taboos, etc., on and on. And I have two examples. Homosexuality was once moral. Many people no longer consider it immoral. And of course, there are still some who do. Slavery and human trafficking, once considered moral, is now considered immoral in many countries. And there are still countries who consider slavery perfectly okay and continue the practice. So some ethical standards are shifting over time. We need to be aware of that. And we need to try to identify pseudo-ethics as opposed to universal ethics. Critical thinkers recognize the danger of confusing sociocentric values, which happen to be mostly pseudo-ethics, with credible ethics. Now we're going to get into our egocentric nature.
Jim, I have a question for you.
Okay, go right ahead.
How do we know what is a universal ethic? How does that get defined?
That actually comes from our understanding of cultures around the world who have universally adopted that particular ethic, and it's not generally controversial. So it's for that reason it's referred to as universal. So the golden rule is an example, and actually the first of the two universal ethics that I cited is a rewording of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is supposedly the golden rule. And I reworded it because I don't really think that I could do unto others as I would like for them to do unto me. I'd like them to give me all of their money, but I can't give them all of mine. So I don't think that is stated very good. Instead, I would rather say that we should not subject other people to malevolent treatment that we ourselves would not like to be subjected to. That I can do. So I have reworded that universal ethic, but I think that any culture around the world would ascribe to that as being an ethical idea. And those ideas come from, well, actually, all morality comes from human experience. It evolves. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how morality evolves. A man and a woman on a ship, and it shipwrecks. And they manage to make it to this island where they're the only two people there. Well, the man decides that he would like to have sex with this woman, but she's not in favor of that idea. So his solution is to rape her. So he does that, and immediately thereafter, as is natural for a lot of men, he goes to sleep. And she goes down the beach, finds her a nice big stick of driftwood. They would make a nice club, and she comes back and she starts beating him in the head and in his arms and legs, and just about kills him, but doesn't quite kill him. He manages to survive, and after a few weeks, he's good as new. But they sit down and they have a conversation between the two of them. And the man agrees that he must respect the sovereignty of a woman over her own body. And so from that point on, that moral rule or standard governs the behavior of that man. And as they work together in cooperation, and that's really what is necessary, is morality and ethics are derived from recognizing the need for cooperation with each other for the best welfare of the group. So that works really in every village, town, country on earth. And of course, we see that there is a lot of different variation between countries and cultures, because different cultures do have different problems to solve. And also some cultures are more advanced than others. So that explains the reason why slavery in some countries persists. They have not had the, I want to say, critical thinking skills to recognize that human rights should be extended to everyone and not just some. I hope that answered that question.
Basically, I just wanted to remind people that you have welcome questions at any time. So if somebody wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll acknowledge that. So I apologize for interrupting you, but I'm just a little, when you say universal, just as the term truth, I find those two terms to be very difficult to deal with, because as Saeed pointed out in the chat, as slavery was considered a universal ethic for a very long time, and rape was considered quite acceptable by people as they evolved, and it's part of, I think, the animal nature of even dolphins have been known to rape other female dolphins. Male dolphins have been known to rape female dolphins. So it's something that's exhibited in all animals, but it's still not acceptable in any way in human behavior. But I do have a problem with the concept of universality and truth.
From my understanding, slavery was, as you pointed out, a universal ethic. And later on, it ceased to be a universal ethic. So universal ethics are subject to change. I think that the understanding of universal is what is universal today, not what was universal in the past. So there's certainly a lot of disagreement about ethics. This is a area of great contention in the philosophical world. And so my position is I would just want to do the best I can. I see Brent had his hand up. Well, unmute your microphone, Brent, and weigh in.
Okay. Yeah, the thing is, I think it's a misunderstanding of the term universal, because even though it might have been universally accepted among people who owned slaves, I don't think the slaves accepted it universally.
Right.
So universal ethic would be something that, you know, everybody would agree on, even if they're in the circumstance of being the person afflicted by it or not benefiting from it. So I think it's just a misunderstanding of the term universal. Just because it's acceptable around the world by the ruling class does not mean it's acceptable in general.
Correct. No more questions? I will continue. I want to talk about our egocentric nature. Our egocentric nature is self-validating, self-centered, and arrogant. We tend to prioritize our egocentricity over everything else. People like to see themselves as rational animals, when in reality, we're mostly self-deceiving animals whose capacity to deceive ourselves seems unlimited. I would like to give some examples. Egocentric thinking is the inclination to fail to notice, ignore, or forget evidence that contradicts our beliefs and remember evidence that supports them. It's the inclination to think in absolutist ways with a narrow point of view. It's the inclination to see ourselves as always right, in possession of absolute truth. It's the inclination to overlook the inconsistencies in what we say we believe versus what our actions indicate. It's the inclination to ignore the complexity of an issue in favor of a shallow analysis, especially when doing so serves the interest of validating our beliefs. It's the inclination to overlook absurdities and contradictions in thinking that supports our beliefs. It's the inclination to react defensively when our beliefs come under scrutiny, especially when we fear or know they are flawed. We have natural desires of the human mind. It's our self-interests to always appear intelligent and correct in what we believe, to convince others to embrace our beliefs, to avoid scrutiny of our assertions, to win the argument no matter what, whenever our assertions are challenged, to maintain the appearance of ethical reasoning and behavior, and to avoid accountability when we are caught using unscrupulous methods. The logic we employ oftentimes, it's true because I want it to be true. It's true because I believe it's true. It's true because many others whom I respect believe it's true. It's true because I've always believed it's true. And it's true because it serves my selfish interest to believe it's true. Proof of egocentrism is in the observation of it. You can think about how many times you've observed people thinking and acting selfishly without regard for the truth or the needs of others. We observe intransigent closed-mindedness. We observe people dismissing important or omitting important facts, using misinformation, half-truths, appeals to bias, demagoguery, hate, and fear. And the problem is, we tend to think the problem is with someone else, not with ourselves. We are all highly skilled in the art of self-deception. Questions or comments? Now we'll talk about our culture-bound sociocentric nature. The natural tendency to see the world through a group-shared, biased mentality, rigidly characterized by some things we must do, some things we cannot do. Those are taboos. And some things we can do. The proof of sociocentrism is in the observation of groupthink and the rules that impinge upon freedom of conscience and the exercise of personal freedom. What are the inclinations of our sociocentric nature? The inclination to place our nation, religion, politics, etc., on a pedestal above all others. The inclination to think positively about ourselves and negatively about those who are different or disagree with us. The inclination to embrace cultural, nationalistic, political, or religious groupthink without an inclination to question or challenge it. The inclination to blindly embrace arbitrary or coercive social restrictions and taboos. The failure to recognize or think beyond the prejudices of one's own culture. The failure to recognize bias, propaganda, and sophistry in the media. The failure to distinguish universal ethics from pseudo-ethics. The failure to recognize the sociocentric mindset as an impediment to our intellectual growth. The solution, of course, is to recognize our sociocentric natures and aspire to consider alternatives to them. Questions?
Well, I have a practical question, I think. It seems to me that what you're describing is the very nature of our society right now. We have those of us who are right and those of us who are wrong. And we are in conflict. And I'm not sure how we get out of that conflict, and it may not be appropriate for this discussion.
Actually, it is.
What do we do? Because those of us who are rational, so to speak, and critically thinking, how do we overcome and get past this chasm that is being built between the two groups in this country?
Well, I think this is where a critical thinker has an advantage. Because if you have no capacity to think critically, there's no hope for you. And unfortunately, the majority of us are not very skilled in critical thinking. We have our bias, and we think we're right about everything. Of course, if we thought we were wrong, we'd change it, obviously. But what we need to do is to try to think with a little empathy, for one thing, which is another way of saying we're bringing ethics to the conversation. And I think, well,
Can I raise my hand?
is there a hand up?
Yeah, Gary
Well,
has his hand up.
Okay.
I'd like to be next after Gary.
Okay, Joe.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I posted an item in the chat board. If you'll read that, and my request is for you to comment on it.
Well, I'm not able to read the chat at the moment with the slide presentation on screen.
Okay,
But
so
if
let me just voice
Yeah,
it.
I'm not seeing it in chat, Gary, so please go ahead.
No, I'd sent it to Mr. Young privately.
Oh, I see,
Um,
okay.
It was this. Please comment on this observation. It seems these definitional points are the basis of the concept of quote unquote faith for religions and other non-fact quote unquote norms established by cultures. I was just asking for your comment on that.
Well, I need to see if I understand that question. Would you repeat that? It seems what?
Yes, you were offering definitional comments about and my question, my statement was that the definitional points that you were sharing seem to be the basis of the concept of faith, or the concept of norms, things that are non-fact established by cultures. Am I making the right connection?
A lot of those would be, I don't necessarily want to say that they're blind faith in every case. I don't want to group them and with such a broad net, because different cultures do have different challenges, and which bear and have an impact on those cultures. Actually, in this presentation, I don't talk about faith, but I will mention that at this moment, since you brought the term up. From my understanding, faith is, well, the dictionary definition is confidence in a person, an idea, or a thing. But we have actually three types that are employed. We have blind faith, which is faith in ideas without any evidence whatsoever. And then we have faith in ideas which are substantiated by evidence. And then we have faith that is actually hostile to evidence. So as a critical thinker, what I have to do, I realize that I do not have the ability to personally confirm every idea. For example, in the scientific community, I can't explain the theory of gravity. I can't really do a good job defending evolution on a technical basis. I am putting faith in the scientific community because I know that the scientific community is subject to the scientific method, for one thing, and also to peer review. And those two facts give me confidence or faith in the scientific community. So I think that faith is not blind at all. It's based on well-substantiated facts. But we do see that there are cultures in the, or let's say the religious community, they don't base anything on facts. They base it on dogma and what they want the reality to be. So they have this perception of an alternative worldview where there are angels behind every clouds and demons whispering in your ear, and it's to me very crazy, but it's all blind. It's without any evidence whatsoever. I don't know whether I addressed your question satisfactorily, but that's the best I can do.
You actually added supplemental content, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, for your question. Mr. Reinhardt, you had a question or a comment? And you're muted.
Okay, I am unmuted.
There you
You can hear
go.
me now?
Yes.
Just a quick comment, and back when the discussion was having to do with swaying people to your opinion and being persuasive and having your own biases. And that is what every salesman knows. It's a cliche, but when someone asks you for your opinion, they don't want to hear your opinion. What they want to hear is their opinion coming out of your mouth.
That is exactly correct. That's really one of the gist of egocentric thinking. And when I talk to let's say religious fundamentalists, and they demand evidence, and I provide them evidence, and then they dismiss it. So it goes to what you were saying, Joe. They're not interested in entertaining what you have to say. They want you only to entertain what they have to say. So they're functioning on a totally egocentric basis. Going to move on to.
Well, just one moment, Mr. Peterson.
Oh, one more? Okay.
He had put something in the chat room. Jim Peterson, did you want to share that in the discussion?
Well, actually, everybody can see it in the chat room. It's not necessary.
Okay.
But proceed, please.
Okay. Despite all of our egocentric and sociocentric inclinations, we actually do have a natural capacity for reason. Reasoning is the process of trying to figure something out. One of the problems is that even though we have a natural capacity for reasoning, it's not well developed naturally. We're not naturally endowed with the capability to think critically. So we have to work on it. We have to recognize the problems in ourselves and strive to avoid them, and we must try to tap into critical thinking skills that many times we're oblivious to, or we just set aside. And this is going back to what Joe just said. If we consciously recognize our egocentric tendencies, this will help us stop and just listen to what others have to say. Doesn't mean we're going to necessarily find that they have a good argument, but we at least should objectively entertain it. Now I want to talk about some of the concepts that I got from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm not going to go into depths, but I bring them to your attention because you might want to investigate and see what they have to say on these topics. But I will address them briefly. So the 8 elements of reason are really can be posed as questions. What purpose does this thinking serve? What questions need to be asked? What information is needed What inferences, interpretations, conclusions need to be considered? What concepts apply? Definitions, laws, theories, models, principles. What assumptions are being made? What are the implications or consequences? And what other points of view are possible? Anyone wish to make a comment or ask a question is free to do.
Yes, I would. In regard to the last point, point of view, that also involves, it seems to me, the concept of contextualization. That is, whenever you're making an argument about something or a point about something, it's always contained within the relevant information, the life experience, history, science, whatever you're making the point about. Or at the very minimum, it is contained within the logic of the structure of the argument itself. But it just seems to me that we forget how important it is to have that context to refer to place the question properly. Any question, any argument, any premise does not stand by itself. It is something that is related to other factors. And if we want to present the entire picture and make a point convincingly, it seems that we have to be able to branch out and point to all the other factors connected to that single point of argumentation in order to convey the strength of the argument itself. Would you find that to be an agreeable position?
I would absolutely agree. And with that, in anything, see, this is just a list of 8 bullets, if you will. That doesn't really do justice to the topic. But you can go on YouTube and hear a lot of discussion. Now, what you brought up is being the context. That is something that integrates into this somewhere, obviously, because at least that's what we should be doing. We should integrate the context of whatever the issue is that we're thinking about. Okay.
I want to have a.
Go ahead.
I want to step back just a little bit to the idea of people being naturally critical thinkers. I think that is true to a point, but the problem is that we are indoctrinated from birth practically by an assault on critical thinking. We are encouraged, for example, by religion to take things on faith, to not question them, to not look for actual facts. We're encouraged by marketing because most sales are based on emotion, not fact. And, sports car ads, for example, that show the guys with beautiful women, of course, are not based on how good the sports car are, but are based on, a concept that is not logical. Politicians don't want us to think rationally. Any rational person, for example, is not going to pick up a gun and go risk their life for something that may not benefit anyone, but certainly won't benefit them if they're dead. And of course, that goes back to religious indoctrination that if everyone in the world believed or accepted the fact that there's no evidence that whatsoever we have an afterlife, people would be a lot more unwilling to give up the life they have than they are now. So.
Well, you're right about that Brent, I think I'm going to add a little something to what we said earlier on the topic of our having the capability or the capacity to reason. Let's remember that there are what I want to say are simple questions that can be answered yes or no based on facts. Critical thinking is not really required a whole lot, except that we do need to recognize these obstacles that we have to employing critical thinking. So if we don't have these biases and other issues that are keeping us from thinking critically, we're going to think critically when it comes to simple questions, no problem. Where critical thinking really is important is when we come to complex questions. And a lot of people have an inclination to treat complex questions as though they are simple questions. It's really crazy, but that's what people do. You know, they take a complex question, like let's say abortion. It is a complex issue. There's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration. People don't want to take all those factors into consideration, and they oftentimes don't want other people to take those into consideration. But yeah, there is an element in our nature. We do have some capability for reasoning, but we need to nurture it. And I'll tell you that if a person recognizes what the problems, what the obstacles are to quality thinking, that's half the battle. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I think we sometimes exaggerate or are overly impressed by the resistance of many social institutions to new ways of thinking that would challenge their dominance. But I think we should give more consideration to the fact that without critical thinking, there would be no invention, innovation, or change of any kind. And we know we're living in a world that's full of change, and we're also living in a world that requires change. If we were to meet certain kinds of challenges, like the crisis of the environment, or the crisis with our healthcare, with the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're going to have original and critical thinking taking place. So I'm rather optimistic that that our situation right now in history, in the context of history, will allow us to take advantage of a good deal more critical thinking. And I think we should feel encouraged and encourage others, just as you are doing, Jim. Thanks.
Yes, I'm trying, I hope. Okay, I'm going to, okay, go ahead.
Is there not a evolutionary advantage in some respects to non-critical thinking? Because you can't always examine a situation when you're, there are shortcuts the brain takes that probably would be considered an advantage evolutionarily wise to not analyzing everything. If you hear rustling in the woods, you don't have time to sit there and decide, you know, to think about all the options. You either run or you get eaten, kind of thing. And I realize that if you live in that situation, you have a much more complex understanding of what that rustling means. But there seems to be there are some brain wiring that is advantageous to non-critical thinking, and I see Bill Norsworthy has his hand up. So.
Well, what you point out is true. We do have a natural instinctive reaction to threats, or what we perceive to be threats. I will say that I think that critical thinking is at a huge disadvantage because most institutions that we encounter in our daily lives are encouraging us to think uncritically. Just as was pointed out, when you see these commercials on television, you're constantly bombarded with ideas for which there is no evidence. They are appealing to you on the basis of fear or ignorance or emotion or a number of things. Who out there is asking us to think critically? Only the scientific community that I know of, only the academic community that I know of. But in our everyday interaction with other people in our community, they're not encouraging us to think critically. So unless we somehow recognize the importance of it, we may go through life and never think critically. We may go through life just being manipulated by this group and then another group and then another group and then another group, and stay confused all the time. Anyway, that's my take on that.
Bill Norsworthy had a question, I believe.
Okay.
Actually, I more have a comment, and I think it is exactly in line with what you're saying, but I think there is an evolutionary aspect to this where non-critical thinking is valuable, and that is the fact that we are basically herd animals. We like and require hierarchies to survive in nature back, a few million years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And we have suddenly, and I mean in evolutionary terms, suddenly found ourselves in this industrial age, technological age, where critical thinking becomes a very high value. But we didn't evolve to think that way. We evolved to follow the leader. When we go into battle, tell me where to go and I'll go. It's that kind of thinking. There's no value, survival value, to people questioning the authority all the time. By the time you've gotten all the answers, you're dead.
Well, we're living in an age where we're being asked to follow the authority all the time. And I'll say that people who are tuning in to Fox News and they tune in to Tucker Carlson and Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and all of these demagogues, they don't have critical thinking skills and are oblivious to them. They're just there to suck it up without question.
I'd like to point out that there's a difference between individual survival and species survival, because what he was describing there, a matter of following the leader and doing what he says, etc., that goes for species survival. It's definitely an advantage to the species if the leader, takes you in and goes against the other group or whatever. If he's good at planning, then more likely the group will survive. But you necessarily won't survive if he tells you to go out there and charge the position of the machine gunner. You might not survive. The group, however, is. So we have to differentiate between critical thinking by the group and critical thinking by the individual, because oftentimes the critical thinking applied by the group is not necessarily to the benefit of the critical thinking applied by the individual.
most certainly not the frontline soldier. They don't get to question. They just must follow orders. Go ahead, Jim.
Point out that when you encounter people who are political and religious fanatics of one sort or another, they will often tell you that they are critical thinkers.
Oh, absolutely.
And that their position was arrived at through critical thinking.
Yep.
Now, I think they have perhaps a slightly different concept of what critical thinking is, something rather different from what you've presented thus far.
Well,
So,
Jim, first of all, they recognize that intellectuals respect critical thinkers, and they want to appear to be intellectual. So, almost, I would say at least 75% of the people that I argue with about religion will claim that they are critical thinkers. And then I can ask them, would you mind telling me what the definition of critical thinking is? They cannot define it. And I would ask, well, what are some of the obstacles to critical thinking? They couldn't tell, they can't even begin to tell me. So yeah, people throw a lot of stuff around. And also another thing that they do is they'll say, I'm a scientist. Yeah, so for instance, a guy you're arguing with, he's a dentist, and he's going to argue with you about evolution, and you talk about the scientific community. He says, well, I'm a scientist. Anybody can claim to be a scientist, just like anybody can claim to be a singer. They could have the world's worst voice. Anybody can claim to be a philosopher. They took a class of philosophy. All of a sudden, now they're a philosopher. We have to be aware of this. I mean, because when somebody says that makes these claims, I try not to make these claims deliberately. You'll notice I didn't try to expound upon my credentials. Sometimes jokingly, I will say, well, I got a PhD. I'm a graduate from the University of Hard Knocks. Obviously, I'm joking. I don't have a degree from any university. But that's one of the things people will do to try to, it's a part of the deceiving your audience process. All right, are we done with this topic? I'll go to the next slide. We're close to the end. Now, these are essential intellectual traits for critical thinkers. There's several of them here. I think there's 9 or 8. 2, 4, 6, 8. We need to employ this in our thought processes. It will help us. In fact, it's deemed as essential, and I'll just go through them briefly. We need to exercise humility instead of arrogance. We need to have courage instead of cowardice. We need to employ empathy instead of intellectual narrow-mindedness. We need to exercise intellectual autonomy versus intellectual conformity. We need to have intellectual integrity versus intellectual hypocrisy. We need to have intellectual perseverance instead of intellectual laziness. And we must have confidence in reason instead of distrusting reason and evidence. And then we must have fair-mindedness instead of an intellectual unfairness. Comments? Now, these are the universal intellectual standards that the Foundation of Critical Thinking teaches. Much like the elements of thought, each one of these is a topic in itself. I'm not going to try to teach these concepts today. I only put them here so that you can be aware of them. They deal with clarity of the issue under consideration, accuracy of the data, the precisionness of the data, the relevance, the depth, the breadth, the logic, the significance, and the fairness. So unless there's any questions on this, I'm not going to spend any time on this at all, but I would encourage you, you can find YouTube videos in which all of these universal intellectual standards are discussed, and you can, I found them to be quite informative.
I want
And
to
now back
make
go
a
ahead.
comment about YouTube videos. You have to be very careful because there are YouTube videos that purport to be about critical thinking that are not.
Well, hopefully, after you have attended this presentation, you'll be able to recognize that. A resource for further education, I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in taking a course, there are several modules to this particular course that's offered by S.J. Kinney College of Law. You can Google this, well, you can YouTube search for critical thinking, and you'll find S.J. Quinney or Judy. If you would be willing to have this put in the newsletter so that anybody that's attended today's presentation can go to follow this link, and it'll take them right to the course. And I went through the course, I viewed the videos, they're really packed with concepts. I watched some, and then the next day I went back and watched the same thing over again. And the next day I went back and watched some more over again until I slowly worked my way through the entire course. But the thing about it is, it's there. You can take your time. You don't have to be in a rush. And each of these videos are like 10 to 15 minutes in duration. So, you know, it's something that can be done a little each day over time. So that wraps up my presentation. I'm going to go off screen.
Well, while you're doing that, I'd also like to recommend a website called Logically Fallacious.
Okay.
It's got a collection, a searchable database of logical fallacies, and there's a discussion board, and it's really a good resource when you're trying to point out exactly why someone is making a fallacious argument.
Well, you can find a ton of resources, and all you got to do is put in the search box critical thinking or the name of a college in critical thinking, and it'll take you to whatever videos that are there. So I've watched a lot of them.
Jim, I'd like to thank you for giving us just enough of an introduction to critical thinking to allow us to be able to distinguish the other critical thinking courses from the faux critical thinking courses.
Yes,
We'll probably need that, I think.
I think so. And Brent, if you'll send me the link to that
Yeah.
site, I'll put it in with our stuff, our
I
information.
put the link in the chat already.
Okay,
Judy?
great.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
And as I think I said earlier, this is all going to go up on YouTube, and people will be notified when it's available. And all the links will be available via YouTube and via our emails.
Well, I thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity. I have long wanted to do a presentation on critical thinking. And of course, I admit that there is a ton of critical thinking concepts I have not covered. I only really covered obstacles to critical thinking in hopes that we can recognize those in ourselves. It will help us a great deal. I must stress that 50% of the battle is discovering what we're doing wrong. And so even though this is not a course in critical thinking, it was hopefully raise our awareness and inspire us to go and search for more information.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I'm done.
Okay. I thank everyone very much. Any questions that anyone has, please feel free to send them to me and I can forward them on to Jim or to other people. And if you have something about critical thinking you would like to see discussed in the future, we can make those arrangements. We can try to clarify some of the, this was a very complex issue and a very challenging one for me. So I appreciate the effort you put into this. Tony, did you have a question or comment?
No,
No? Okay. So I thank everyone for coming, and we will be back next week to discuss evolution. And we will have, as I said earlier, we have lots of topics in the future coming up. If anybody has a topic they want covered or a speaker they would like to have included, please let me know and we will see what we can do to get that done.
I have one last question.
Oh, sure.
Oh, he went away. I was going to ask Brent why his head kept disappearing all the time.
Oh, that's because of his.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
That's all right.
All right.
Very funny.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and have a good week, and we'll see you next week for evolution.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Jim Young, and thank you, everybody. Good presentation.
Thanks. You too all.
Thank you. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.
Hey there, Joe. Yeah, that was great. Really enjoyed it.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Okay, I'm gonna go rest.
Good. You deserve it.
Bye now.
Bye. Andrea, I guess.
Bye, everybody.
Yep, she left too. Did you, I guess you didn't need the closed captioning this time, but Andrea?
It helped a lot.
Oh, good.
Judy, it helped a lot.
Good.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.